When the first Western-supplied F-16 arrived in Ukraine in August 2024, many hailed the jet as a potential game-changer in the war. No, the F-16 wouldn't win the battle for Ukraine, but it would open up opportunities for Ukraine's pilots to conduct operations that were previously impossible with the country's aging fleet of Soviet-era fighter jets. Ukraine has indeed been using its F-16s to great effect, but perhaps not in the way that the West or Russia expected. Traditional Western aerial tactics don't work on the brutal Ukrainian battlefield, meaning Ukraine had to do what it has done so many times already in its battle against Vladimir Putin's forces: adapt. Now, Ukraine's pilots are using genius tactics to beat Russia's air defenses. We learned a little about those tactics and why the traditional Western approach to using fighter jets doesn't work, due to the comments of a pilot in a recent video released by the Ukrainian Air Force. That pilot, who the Warzone or TWZ says appears to be one of the older generation of Ukraine's fighter pilots, explains that the tactics taught to Ukraine's aviators ahead of the F-16 arrival in their country weren't quite what those pilots needed to know. After we returned home, we faced reality, the pilot said, before adding, "The tactics we were taught were not entirely suitable for the war we are fighting. The war is fundamentally different." On the surface, this seems like a strange claim to make. The F-16 is hardly a new aerial platform. According to Lockheed Martin, which manufactures the jet, the F-16 was first conceived during the early 1970s, with the initial models officially entering service in time for the 1980s to begin. That makes the jet as old, if not older in some cases, as those that Ukraine had before Putin launched his invasion. With almost 50 years of knowledge behind them, the NATO instructors who taught Ukraine's pilots how to use the jets must surely have known precisely how they were to be used. And on the technical front, that assumption would be right. Ukraine's challenges didn't arise because its pilots weren't taught how to fly their new jets properly. They arose because the tactics that their NATO trainers taught them aren't suitable for the type of war that Ukraine is fighting against Russia. Why is that? The main issue was that NATO's tactics assume that whoever is flying the F-16 will be doing so in a situation where their allies have established air superiority over wherever a war is raging. The definition of air superiority was laid down in an April 1931 edition of a Royal Air Force Quarterly, with the publication stating, "Air superiority may be described as the attainment of operational freedom by our own aircraft and denying it to the enemy." The outlet pointed out that this doesn't necessarily mean that one side's air force is utterly exhausted, or that the other side has complete dominance. Rather, air superiority means that the side that has it is generally able to complete missions due to having a larger or better air force than its enemy, which amounts to the superior side facing a minimal threat from its opponent's air force. Not a lot has changed since that nearly century-old definition was given, and air superiority is something that Ukraine doesn't have in its battle against Russia. We see what this means for Ukraine's attempts to use its F-16s in the description of a mission provided by the pilot in the video we mentioned earlier. But the biggest challenge for us was the enemy air threat, which kept us from getting to the target, the pilot said of the mission. The fact that an enemy air threat exists to such an extent shows us that Ukraine doesn't have air superiority over its own territory, which in turn means that the strategies taught to the country's pilots by their NATO instructors won't quite work. The pilot then explains what Ukraine did instead of following the traditional NATO strategies, adding, "We worked in a group of 3 planes and forced the enemy to launch 2 missiles from different directions. As a result, we gave our strike plane the chance to destroy the target and let the whole group return safely to the airfield, back to our families and squadron." The National Interest adds a little more in its own report on the pilot's statement. It points out that Western pilots almost always have air superiority in whatever region they fly, which has led to assumptions of superiority creeping into training doctrine. When that superiority doesn't exist, NATO's tactics aren't as effective as Ukraine needs them to be, and sadly, it's unlikely that Ukraine is going to achieve full air superiority over its territory at any point in the foreseeable future. A large part of the reason why is that the country simply doesn't have an air force large enough to achieve that superiority. The World Directory of Modern Military Aircraft, or WDMMA, highlights that in its 2026 Ukrainian Air Force Inventory Report. The WDMMA says that Ukraine currently has 261 active units in its Air Force inventory, which presumably includes the fighter jets that Ukraine has received from its Western partners. Though those aircraft allow Ukraine to conduct a wide range of operations, including those related to attacking, logistics, support, and special missions, their number is just too small to cover all of Ukraine, never mind guaranteeing that they can overcome Russia's much larger air force and its air defenses. Specifically, Ukraine has 105 aircraft that fall under the combat or attack banners, not all of which are active. Though far from weak as an aerial power, as the same outlet says that Ukraine ranks 30th out of 129 air services for which it creates reports, Ukraine's numbers simply aren't enough. Russia has far more aircraft. It also loads the portions of Ukraine it occupies with air defenses that make any sortie a dangerous proposition. The WDMMA has published a similar report on Russia's air force for 2026, and the difference in numbers is staggering. The organization says that Russia has 3,677 aircraft in its active inventory, making its active air force about 14 times the size of the one that Ukraine can field. The WDMMA also ranks Russia's air force as the third strongest in the world. So if anything, Russia should have air superiority in Ukraine, and it should have achieved it long ago. But it hasn't. And that's another thing that makes the Ukraine war buck any expectations that traditional Western doctrine might have set for it. As the UK Defence Journal pointed out back in March 2025, Russia has failed to establish air superiority over Ukraine despite having far more aircraft. The situation is so bad for Russia that it has been reduced to primarily using its tactical aircraft, such as the modern Su-34 fighter jet, as airborne artillery that launches missiles and bombs at Ukraine from far behind enemy lines. Ukraine has also proven itself adept at destroying Russian aircraft that enter its territory, even if it isn't necessarily doing so with aircraft of its own. Per Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, Russia has been stung by the losses of 434 planes and 347 helicopters since Putin launched his full-scale invasion, along with the loss of 1,269 anti-aircraft warfare units that would have helped contribute to Russia establishing air superiority of its own. What we end up with is a war in which neither participant has the air superiority that would be assumed. Russia's numerical might hasn't been brought to bear, with the country now being gun-shy enough to keep its aircraft away from Ukraine's forces as much as possible. Unfortunately for Ukraine, it hasn't been able to establish the type of air superiority NATO's F-16 training assumes because it doesn't have enough aircraft, and Russia still has strong air defenses despite its substantial losses. Ukraine also faced other difficulties when trying to learn how to use F-16s the NATO way. The pilot who explained the disparity between NATO training and what's happening in Ukraine highlights that Ukraine's pilots faced several challenges from the moment they entered the cockpits of their new aircraft with their trainers. Describing the really difficult conditions that Ukraine's trainee pilots faced, the older aviator says that these pilots had to learn about new equipment and rules of flying, particularly in civilian airspace, that are different from those they already knew. Plus, in the rear cockpit there was an instructor who did not understand a word of Ukrainian. Communication was in English and an unusual special aviation English, TWZ reports the pilot saying. Of course, these issues were unavoidable. NATO trainers would naturally use English as a universal language of sorts, given the West-focused nature of NATO. They also couldn't be expected to learn Ukrainian in time to teach what Ukraine's pilots needed to know in a short time frame. Never mind learn the language well enough to properly communicate their points while teaching people to fly in jets that can move about twice the speed of sound. It was very exhausting, to be honest, the pilot says. But we had a goal. We understood that they were waiting for us at home and that the enemy was shelling our cities, killing our people, capturing our territory. So we gritted our teeth to the last and continued on this path. Perhaps miscommunications added to the challenges that Ukraine's pilots faced with the utilization of their F-16s. However, the difference between what NATO assumes and the reality in Ukraine was the biggest issue. And that challenge had been compounded by the fact that Russia is at least able to maximize the use of its own air force within the territory that it snatched away from Ukraine. The pilot notes that Russia maintains a threat to any would-be Ukrainian F-16 attacker due to Russia's range of fighter interceptor aircraft. Among them are the MiG-31, Su-35, and Su-57 airframes. Though these aircraft don't enter Ukrainian territory as often as many would have thought they would when the Ukraine war started, they present a major problem for Ukraine's F-16 pilots in the occupied territories where they want to launch their strikes. They have the ability to be in the combat zone at high altitudes, waiting for our groups to strike. And unfortunately, we do not have such an opportunity, the pilot says. Combine these waiting Russian fighter jets with air defense systems that are capable of shooting F-16s out of the sky when the jet gets too close, and you get another reason why Ukraine isn't able to use F-16s the NATO way. Russia's defenses are too strong, making it even harder to create even small pockets of air superiority. With all of these issues ahead of them, Ukraine could have thrown in the towel on its F-16 project, but that isn't the Ukrainian way. As it always finds a way to do, Ukraine managed to take a difficult situation and adapt. A rethink of every strategy taught was needed, and Ukraine's pilots have come up with several ingenious ways that allow them to do damage with their F-16s, even if they don't necessarily follow NATO's training to do that damage. So what are Ukraine's F-16 pilots doing differently? Low-altitude flying is a major part of their rethought strategy. returning to the point that the pilot made about Russia's ability to keep its jets in standby mode at high altitudes within occupied Ukraine, the pilot adds that Russia's air defenses are just as dangerous. If a Ukrainian pilot can avoid the aircraft that Russia deploys, they still have to worry about surface-to-air missiles coming their way. Flying at lower altitudes is often the solution, because doing so makes it far more difficult for Russian air defense radars to identify incoming F-16s, as well as making it harder for missile guidance systems to lock on and track their jets in flight. Those difficulties come from a combination of factors, Militani says. Background noise created by flying close to the ground can confuse the systems upon which Russia relies to identify incoming F-16s. In some cases, flying low to the ground also blocks the sort of clear radar signals that make tracking aerial targets possible when those targets are in open air. Of course, flying low comes with risks of its own, as one false move could lead to a crash. Plus, low-altitude flight isn't a perfect way to avoid Russia's air defenses. As the pilot points out, and we also have to use maneuver tactics when enemy aircraft come at us, lock us up and launch air-to-air missiles at our planes. But regardless of this, with these limited capabilities, we carry out the task. We know that we are taking a risk. The strategy seems to work more often than not. We may also be seeing Ukraine's F-16 pilots taking their cues from the success that the country's drone operators have enjoyed when battling against Russia's air defenses. Back in May 2023, the Centre for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, wrote a piece in which it discussed a then-recent drone attack against Moscow. Ukraine wasn't confirmed as the attacker, though it was likely to be. Whoever struck Moscow understood the two key weaknesses that Russia's air defense systems have against drones. They fly at low speeds and low altitudes, making it hard to hit them from afar, CEPA said. Now Ukraine appears to be using the advantage that its drones enjoy to sneak its F-16s to where they need to be while keeping them out of the sight of Russia's air defense radars. This likely isn't a perfect strategy. Drones have far smaller radar signatures than even the lowest flying fighter jet, due to being made of materials like plastic and being powered by small engines that give off minimal thermal signatures, CEPA says. Plus, they're more maneuverable in the context of evading incoming missiles. Still, low flight is an established Russian air defense weakness, and it's one that Ukraine is increasingly taking advantage of with its F-16s. Not every Ukrainian F-16 deployment requires the country's pilots to evade Russian air defenses. In some cases, those pilots actively seek out Russia's missiles. In another remarkable tactic employed by Ukraine, the country's F-16s often fly as part of larger groups. Within those groups, the F-16s serve as escorts and decoys in an effort to protect other aircraft tasked with carrying precision bombs for strike missions, Militani reports. Rather than avoid Russia's air defenses, these escorting F-16s deliberately expose themselves to enemy aircraft, forcing Russia to fire missiles at the F-16s rather than the aircraft that will actually do the bulk of the damage to whatever target that Ukraine wants to hit. Causing Russia to waste missile stock is a nice side benefit of these types of operation, as this can potentially open the door for future aerial assaults if those stockpiles aren't replenished. You may remember the pilot's quote about Ukraine working in a group of 3 aircraft to overcome a Russian air defense system that we shared earlier in the video. That mission saw this particular F-16 strategy in action. Danger then seems to be par for the course for Ukraine's F-16 pilots. Without the benefit of air superiority that is assumed under NATO's training, Ukraine's aviators have to fly low and use themselves as decoys to ensure that their F-16s can be the difference makers they were believed to be when they first arrived. With such risk can come great reward, but also tragedy. As Euromaidan Press said in November, Ukraine lost 4 of its F-16s during the first 10 months of operations with the jets. Each of those losses seems to have served as a learning experience, as Ukraine suffered no losses between June and November 2025. Even so, 4 downed F-16s is surprisingly low when you consider just how much danger that Ukraine's ingenious strategies require the country's pilots to accept. It's not just the brilliance of Ukraine's pilots that has kept these losses low. As TWZ explains, Ukraine has also gotten into the habit of keeping its F-16s constantly on the move. This seems to be another break from NATO doctrine, as most countries keep their fighter jets in dedicated hangars or, in the case of those that have aircraft carriers, out at sea and ready for strikes. Ukraine does things differently, moving its F-16s constantly and making use of non-traditional airstrips, which TWZ says are likely highways to send its pilots into the skies. The pilot explains this aspect of Ukraine's strategy, stating, "Thanks to our professionalism, our flexibility and ingenuity, we have the opportunity to withdraw from the battle and keep our equipment in places where the enemy does not expect it. We were able to complete tasks from one airfield and moments later redeploy to another." An F-16 that is always on the move is an F-16 that Russia struggles to target when it's on the ground. We can add unpredictability to Ukraine's appetite for increased risk when assessing its F-16 tactics. Of course, this tactical turnaround wouldn't mean much if Ukraine wasn't getting results after its pilots had adapted what they had learned from their NATO trainers to the Ukrainian battlefield. But if there's one thing that Ukraine has to show for its high-flying ingenuity, it's the results. According to Ukraine's Air Force, the country's F-16s have successfully intercepted over 1,300 Russian missiles and drones between their introduction into Ukraine and November 2025. That's a huge number, amounting to an average of about 86 interceptions per month. In these cases, Ukraine is using its F-16s in a defensive capacity, meaning its pilots rarely have to worry about the types of issues raised in this video. However, Ukraine is also growing increasingly successful in its strikes against ground targets in occupied territories. As Militani reports, Ukraine's F-16s have also managed to destroy more than 300 ground targets, including command posts, ammunition depots, logistical facilities, and UAV control stations as of November. These strikes may not have been possible if Ukraine hadn't figured out how to best use its F-16s after realizing that NATO's air superiority-dependent strategies weren't going to work. The future may hold more of the same. As TWZ notes, Ukraine has been promised 87 F-16s by its Western partners in Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Not all of these jets have been delivered, with the biggest delay coming from Belgium. That country is waiting to receive F-35s from the United States that are intended to replace its aging F-16 stocks, and those F-35s have taken a long time to arrive. Finally, October 2025 saw the first batch of these F-35s arrive in Belgium around 7 years after the purchase was made, which may mean that Ukraine will take delivery of at least some of the 30 F-16s Belgium has promised to it in 2026. More F-16s lead to more opportunities to carry out the types of operations that Ukraine has spent a little over a year mastering. Ukraine may not be doing things that NATO, but then the Ukraine war has not been fought anything like NATO might have anticipated. One thing is for certain: Ukraine's F-16 strategies are effective, and Russia is paying the price in lost positions, equipment, drones, and missiles. And as we move deeper into 2026, Russia may have a lot more to contend with than Ukraine's growing stockpile of F-16s. Swedish-made Gripen fighter jets may start arriving in Ukraine this year, alongside a host of other weapons that could make Ukraine a more potent attacking force than ever before. Find out more about these incoming weapons in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of Ukraine's latest and greatest tactics. And thank you for watching.